Bad. I find so embarrassing.
Can you hear me?
Did I switch off mine? I was trying to do that, but I... Okay, so I didn't switch off mine. Yeah,
Now, I think you can hear me.
yeah, you also presented today. Like,
Good morning.
Yeah.
Sorry about the slight delay, some technical problems in the morning. Today we're going to talk about refugee policies and migration politics. This has been one of FAFO's key topics since the start of the international activities at FAFO. When, as you might remember, Tajir Larsen went to the Middle East with his wife and started living condition studies with Palestinian refugees. And since then, we have basically been working on various aspects of refugee assistance. Of course, first in the Middle East with Palestinians, but also in Congo, Uganda, and we have been working in Iraq, and now on Syrian refugees. So this seminar today is part of a refugee council project that we have on migration policies and secondary mobility in refugee populations. That we have. And we have some very interesting speakers here today. But first, just a few words about what we are talking about today. These processes of globalization that we've seen over the last decades has made it much easier for everybody to travel. And this goes for refugees as well. Cost of travel is much lower. Information on migration routes is easily available everywhere for everybody who wants to travel on their own. People have GPSs on their mobile phones so that they're actually able to move on their own without too much assistance. But also information about what life abroad can entail is much more easily available. People watch the same TV shows as we do, also in the refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon, and they do so in Uganda as well. This idea of what life in Europe entails and what opportunities are there are also much more widely dispersed. The world has become smaller, and it's easier to learn to desire to migrate, and it's easier to migrate. And this was accentuated, I think, in 2015, when Europe saw this unprecedented inflow of refugees arriving. Most of them had the right to refuge, according to the Refugee Convention, that most of the European states that were receiving them had ratified. But still, this fear of the impact of these basic functions, on the impact of these large migration flows on the basic functions, resulted in what we think of as a race to the bottom among European states that were competing to be the least attractive in order to make sure that they were not the ones getting too many migrants. And rather than admitting to how and why they were reducing the rights to the refugees, we saw this twist of the narrative, the ways of talking about migration, where you were increasingly arguing that there is a need to help the refugees in the areas close to home. Kind of the focus was shifting from integration at home to how can we help them in the near abroad. The argument that it's better and more efficient to help refugees in the vicinity of conflict zones has this one been a key argument on the populist right. And the left tend to accuse the populist right of using this argument just as an excuse for not giving asylum in Europe. However, when and this association with the populist right has made it a bit taboo in a way to talk about how we can better facilitate for refugee assistance in neighbouring areas. However, when I was in Syria and Lebanon this spring and summer, I was taken by surprise by one thing. I had this question now posed to almost all the refugees that I was talking to. I can give you a choice. If I were to give you a choice, you could choose either that you could stay here in Lebanon or Jordan. You can get all the documents that you need to stay legally and kind of not fear for your future, and you get a job and you get school for your children and a job with a decent salary that you can live off. Or you can choose to go to Europe as a refugee tomorrow. What would you choose? And 90% of them, they didn't even hesitate to say they would rather stay where they were if they had predictability, economic security, and access to schooling for the children. And this, and if you think about it, it's not really that hard to understand. They want to be in a country where they know the language, they know the culture, and where they have the friends and the relatives nearby. The idea of moving into a different setting, a different country, where everything is foreign to you, is not really the first choice of anybody when you are in. However, for some, the idea of the political systems of Europe was so important that they still would prefer going to Europe. But this was definitely the minority. The problem is, of course, that they do not get access to this kind of protection and stability in the areas where they are living. Most of them have unstable, underpaid jobs if they find employment at all. They don't get permanent residency, and the local governments are trying to push them to return to Syria while they feel at a point where they still don't feel safe themselves. So that the life in refuge in Jordan and Lebanon is very difficult. And for many, the dream of Europe becomes a dream of stability, predictability, and economic security. For the countries around Syria, Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, the large numbers of refugees have brought with them major challenges. The high number of refugees can boost an economy, and has been proven to do so if you look at the overall statistics. But this boost in the economy mainly comes from access to cheap labor. And it comes from the inflow of aid money into the economy that mainly benefits the wealthy. And you get kind of job opportunities. The job opportunities are for the educated people that know foreign languages and can work as translated with the expat community. And also some kind of expat economy that you get some kind of the ones facilitating for restaurants in for the expats. For large parts of the population, large inflows of refugees means competition for wages. There are people willing to work for half your salary coming in competing with you. And in the case of the Syrians, very often they are skilled and highly qualified workers who know the language and can easily take your job from you. So you see this, although on a statistical level, high inflows of refugees can boost an economy, the impact for the majority of the population can be dire unless there are policies put in place in order to regulate this. And the policies that are usually put in place is hindering access to labour markets for the refugees that are there, just as we do in Norway. And it is against this backdrop that we are going to look at the policies of refugee protection in areas close to the conflict zone today when Carmel is coming to the floor. We're going to ask if and how the international community can alleviate this strain on the local populations that the local population is experiencing. And if there are ways that we can reduce the consequences of the inflow of refugees. Is it at all conceivable that countries like Jordan and Lebanon will give refugees that cannot return to Syria the predictability and stability that they need in order to not move on to Europe? Or can we expect new waves of refugees coming to seek asylum? With Turkey threatening to send its refugees towards the European border regularly, and also you have Idlib, which is the last province in Syria, where you have, 3.5 million rebels, Islamists, most of them, still living. And they're probably just waiting for Syria to finally occupy them, driving these migrants, these potential refugees, where are they going to go? I don't think Turkey is going to accept them. And they're coming to Europe. So if we get these new waves of migrants into Europe, has Europe learned from the 2015 setting? Would anything be different from the 2015 setting this time? Or are we going to have the same situation over again? And this is why we have Natasha later on to talk more about. We have a very interesting panel here today to talk about these things. First of all, we have, first up is Dette. He is a researcher at the ISDO, the Institut Français du Proche-Orient in Beirut. He has been working on refugee issues and refugee mobility for more than a decade, and knows better than most the complexities of the situation in Lebanon, with the presence of both the Palestinians and the Syrian refugee populations. He will be given a 15 minutes presentation, then we have the panel up here for some comments and feedback, and there will be opportunities for questions from the audience. And then we'll give the floor to Natasha Zahn. She will talk. No, I'm doing actually my last. Yeah. She's at the top of the list. She's one of the main experts we have in Europe today, I think, on information and migration policies in Europe, and she has published extensively on the later developments in these areas. Several books and articles on this. She's an assistant professor at the European Institute in LSE in London. Also, she will have 15 minutes before we have the panel. And in our panel, we're happy to have Maya Yamir from the Faculty of Law at the University of Oslo. She has published extensively on refugee rights and living conditions in the Middle East. And she has recently been granted an ERC starting grant to look at the implication of the UN Refugee Convention for states that had not yet ratified it, which is also a very interesting project that I'm looking forward to following. And finally, we have Pernille Rikke, a researcher and coordinator at Knyttes Center for Europe Studies, who has published extensively on European foreign policy. So, on this, I'll give the floor to Anna. Thank you. Let me see. You can stand here if you want. So, do you have a presentation?
No.
No.
Okay, so thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be able to present some of the research we're doing in the Middle East since a few years on the question of hosting refugees. And I will specifically talk today about the Lebanese situation where I'm based. And I will just at the beginning give some contextual elements on the question of asylum in Lebanon in general, and then move to the more specific situation of the Syria since 2011-2012, to then open a more broad reflection on the way refugees and asylum is treated as a policy and the different determinants of the Lebanese policy towards refugees and asylum seekers. First of all, I'd like to say that it's very important to know that Lebanon is not signatory of the 1951 Convention on Refugee Rights. So there is no such a thing that is called an asylum law in Lebanon. And this is quite interesting because it's one of the countries in the world where there is a proportion of refugees to the highest. We have nearly 1 million to 1.5 million refugees, or refugee-like in refugee-like situation, on an overall population of 5 million. So it's like between 20 and 25% of the current Lebanese population is made of refugees. It could be Syrians, Iraqis, but also Palestinians. And this is another, and it's quite interesting because Lebanon also has been hosting refugees since the beginning of the last century, with the settlement of Armenians and Assyrian refugees after the massacres in World War I, then Palestinians and Iraqis and Syrians more recently, and a lot of other smaller groups like Sudanese, Somalis that are also settled in Lebanon since the 1990s. So it's quite interesting. We have a lot of different refugee population in a very small country, but no asylum law. one of the reasons why there is no asylum law in Lebanon is linked to a very specific experience. That's the one of the Palestinians. A lot of Palestinians arrived in 1948 after the creation of the state of Israel, settled in Lebanon, and didn't have the possibility whether to come back to the country of origin or to re-emigrate to third country. So basically they settled, they developed, 50% of them are living in camps, and it's quite a very specific situation that we know that all around the world it's around 20% of the refugees who live in refugee camps. But in Lebanon it's 50% of the population. It's a very, very dense population in the 12 refugee camps that have been set up in 1948 and later on. And these camps have been a place where a lot of different conflicts emerge, armed groups, and today it's poverty pockets. It's one of the poorest area in all over Lebanon. So basically, the Lebanese perception of settling refugees in its own country means possibilities of conflict, means that they will stay on a very long period. Palestinian situation more than 75 years old, will develop camps, poverty, and will be like a problem in many, many different ways of developing cities, master plans in cities, and so on and so forth, and will need assistance for a very, very long period. So Lebanese authorities are really reluctant to renew this experience with new waves of refugees, and this is one of the main reasons why they still resist any form of developing an asylum law in their country. So Lebanon does not consider itself as a country of asylum. When Lebanese say we are a country of asylum, it means, because they wrote it in an agreement they signed with the Lebanese authorities after the Iraqi war, that Lebanon is considered only as a transit country for refugees. So they will not accept long-term settlement of refugees with some rights and recognized as refugees for long periods of time. It means that refugees have two options, considering, the perception of the Lebanese government is whether to come back to the country of origin or to re-emigrate or to be resettled by UNHCR in third countries like European countries. So now if you move to, after this overall brief context of the Lebanese society, well, I will just add a few small elements on the specificities of the Lebanese political context. And maybe nowadays it's under pressure with the revolution or rebellion or people in Lebanon since 3 weeks. Lebanon is a country built on sectarian balance, and so the political power is shared between 3 different sectarian groups. And this sectarian balance is supposed to be linked to demographic balance in the country. So the settlement of large number of refugees, like 20% of the population, on the long term could mean a threat to this demographic balance. So most of the refugees, Syrians and Palestinians mostly, the two largest groups, are Sunni Muslims. And of course, it is only one of the different communities. We have 18 sectarian communities in Lebanon, 13 Christians, and 5 Muslim and Jewish. And so this balance, this demographic balance, can be threatened by the long-term settlement of refugees, mostly coming from only one sectarian background. And so this is another very, very problematic issue for the Lebanese political system. But if we go now to the more specifically to the Syrian situation today, there is this perception that 1 million of refugees is a very, very large number of, and that's true in a way. But we don't have to forget that before 2011, there were at least 400,000 Syrian workers already present in Lebanon. So since the creation of the Lebanese state in the mid-40s, the Syrians have only been the main workforce in Lebanon for all this lower category work, kind of jobs, construction sector, hotels, tourism, agriculture. And so this large number of refugees is also based on the transformation of a part of them from workers to refugees in 2011. It's not that the people came from Syria after 2011, I mean that they were already in Lebanon, and their status had been transformed to refugee, to workers, to refugees. And having an agreement signed after the civil war in Lebanon to regulate and to make a freedom of movement and of access to the labor market for Syrian workers. Post-2011, what happens? A lot of new refugees arrived on the top of this 400,000, bringing it to 1 million and even to 1.5 million. Mainly kids and a large number of women that were present before in the agricultural sector, but in limited numbers. So we had a complete change on the composition of the Syrian population, from mostly young men working to large families arriving. So the pressure on the public sector, that is already very, very difficult situation in Lebanon, especially schools, was extremely high in post-2011 situation. So it means that we passed from a rather circular migration, that was open border between Syria and Lebanon, to a long-term settlement of refugee-like population. And of course it has a lot of impact on main cities and in the countryside of Lebanon. But what is, the challenges that now Lebanon is facing? Different kind of challenges. The first one is the question of the organization of the Lebanese political scene. Lebanese political parties are divided. Half of them are supporting the Syrian government in this process of repression in Syria. And it means that Hezbollah and Amal, the two biggest Shia parties, and one of the Christian parties, one of the current president, Michel Aoun, the Courant Patriotique Libre, is supporting Syrian government. And the other half of the political parties are against Syrian government. It means that if you accept that this large number of Syrians are refugees, it means that the Syrian government is responsible of sending them away from their own country. So it means that you do not support anymore this government. So there is a real political problem of accepting or recognizing them as refugees. So half of the political parties are recognizing them as refugees, and the other doesn't want to recognize them as refugees because of this political link that is very strong between some parties and the Syrian government. So it's a question of bilateral political relation between the countries. So every solution to try to better or to give a status or to bring Lebanon to sign the 1951 convention is linked to this political dimension of the conflict in Lebanon. It's not like an external thing. The second element is linked to the overall perception of what is international assistance and the role of European Union and United States policies or North American policies in the region. There is this perception that this kind of Western policies are often changing. And for example, the case of the Kurds that has been supported by the United States and Western countries for many years to fight ISIS. And suddenly they left and they removed most of their support to this community, into this group, feel that you cannot really trust on the long term the way that European state or Western state will support you facing the conflict. So this lack of long-term perspective on the position of some Western states in the region is the question that you may not rely on their own support if you want to really build a long-term policy. So these possibilities of rupture in international politics is also a question of concern for many states and for many actors in Lebanon. And especially now, the threatening of sanctions of the United States on Hezbollah is extremely strong, and the fear that they will extend this, for example, these sanctions on all the political leaders in Lebanon or on the public institution is the fear of Lebanon. So this is a very important thing. And the last point I wanted to mention is quite also another reflection that we try to develop in our institute with the French Development Agency, the AFD. That has no link with the German extremist party, of course, is the role of humanitarian assistance and the question of development. As mentioned before in the introduction, humanitarian assistance has a large number of money, a huge amount of money, in billions in the region. But this money is very short term and is really linked to emergency aspect of assistance. And everybody knows, and it began in certain places, that this money will not last on the long term. But the population, the refugee population, normally settle on a very long term in these countries. If you look at the different experiences, Palestinians, Iraqi, and now Syrians. And so the question is whether this money goes to development or whether it goes to emergency. And the question of switching from humanitarian emergency action to a long-term development issues that will include local population and refugees is a matter of really interest in the region. So just to conclude, the idea is to try to have a reflection on how a much more humanitarian assistance could be much more development-oriented than only located in a very short-term emergency aspects that would integrate much more local population and try to bring bridges between different groups, whether opposing them with giving assistance to only certain groups and not to the more developing poverty for local population. And thank you for your audience.
Thank you, Hannah. Then I'd like to invite everybody to come up.
Everybody?
Everybody, not everybody, everybody in the panel.
Where do you want us to sit?
I will sit there. Yeah.
Is this a good spot for
that's
me?
a good spot for you.
All right.
Yes, lots of interesting topics, I think. Let me know if you can hear me. That you're bringing up here. And, but I think I'll start with you, Maya. You know Lebanon very well, I think. And what do you think, against this backdrop that Kamil is sketching off, kind of the dilemmas and challenges at Lebanon? Is there any way that the international community can convince Lebanon to ratify the Refugee Convention, or at least go some steps into that direction? And what kind of efforts should that be?
It's very interesting. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be on this panel as well. I really enjoyed listening to you, Kamil, as well. And I'm happy that we're also talking some international refugee law. That's not too often. So Lebanon has a very difficult relationship, I would like to say, with the international refugee regime. In fact, it's one of the few countries that actually participated in drafting the Refugee Convention. Yes. And then it decided not to ratify the convention in the end. And these are some of the things that I've studied and that I've done in my research as well, looking more precisely into Lebanon's relationship with the convention and also with the international refugee regime in its broader sense, including UNHCR, which has been present on Lebanese territory since 1963. So most scholarship sees these, what we can call non-party states, as exceptions to the international refugee regime. They're not interesting to study further. But in this case, I think we can really rightly claim that Lebanon is deeply embedded in this regime, in part for being a participant in the very drafting, but also because they have this very close relationship with UNHCR, where they, for almost a half century now, have sort of let UNHCR take full responsibility for all non-Palestinian refugees in the country. And what's interesting to note as well, as to your question, is that up until about 10 years ago, UNHCR regularly asked Lebanon to ratify the Refugee Convention. And at one point, they actually stopped doing this, and they started advocating for what they called a protection space approach. So they started advocating that Lebanon actually sort of put in place conditions that would de facto provide protection to refugees rather than ratify the convention. What's interesting to see is that other UN organs then began pushing Lebanon to ratify the convention. So we have the committee connected to the Convention Against Torture, the committee connected to the Convention on the Rights of the Child that started advocating for this, as well as European donors. So European donors started pushing UNHCR to again get Lebanon to ratify this convention. And see, these are some of the trends that I've seen in my research as well. And as Kamal rightly pointed out, one of the major issues why Lebanon hasn't ratified the convention is precisely the history of Palestinian refugees. But I would like to say that it's not the only reason as well. I think there's a politically expedient misunderstanding of what the Refugee Convention actually entails. So, for example, there's this idea that it entails permanent settlement, and that, according to the Lebanese constitution, is not allowed in Lebanon. There's this prohibition of settlement of the Tautin prohibition, we can say, of settlement of foreigners. It's a bit unclear exactly which foreigners is meant to, but also there's this politically expedient misunderstanding of the permanent settlement that comes with refugee recognition. And that is actually not true, because it's supposed to be a temporary status.
Okay. Thank you for clearing that up. And I think that also goes for quite a few in Norway, I think, that thinks of it as a permanent status. I'd like to address one of the other things that you, Kamal, brought up that I think is an interesting point. You argued that the Syrian regime is dependent on Syria and on the relationship with Syria, and that they perceive the European states as an unstable partner in this situation, and that this maybe has been accentuated now with the American withdrawal and leaving the Kurdish partners alone, and kind of this kind of project-based short-term interventions from the Europeans. And I think it's a very interesting point that to reflect on. Is our only interest in Lebanon really that we want them to make sure that the refugees stay in Lebanon, and beyond that, we're not really that interested in them? And I'm thinking of you, Pernille. Is that really the main interest? Is Lebanon an important country for the European states, or is it?
I think it is. And it also reflects that Lebanon is part of the neighborhood policy of the EU, the southern neighborhood. And of course, it's much more important than, now and recently the EU has been more concerned about its neighborhood than far away areas. So they have this priority of kind of near abroad, which is the Balkans, and then the neighborhood east especially, but in the south as well, and Lebanon is part of that. And of course, with the migration crisis in 2015, it has become even more important. So I think that there is a distinction. I agree with what you said, that there has a tendency to be short-term. I would maybe say that this is more for the US. I think that the EU has greater interest in the stability in the region. And I think that they try to combine kind of short-term, long-term in a better way than the US managed to, especially under the current administration. And I think that also, there are a lot of disagreement within the EU on how to handle migration, and especially internally, how to kind of with quotas and redistribution and so on. But when it comes to kind of the external policy, it's much more agreement. So they have more kind of increased their fund to development and to and also through different instruments, both when it comes to how Lebanon can assist their refugees, but also when it comes to neighborhood, the European neighborhood instruments and both development, long-term development, and humanitarian assistance. So so I think that the EU has this kind of long-term perspective. But what I think is problematic, and this then I can refer to some of the research we have done at NUPI on EU crisis response, and the main problem that we see in the different areas, we haven't looked at Lebanon specifically, we have looked at Mali and Iraq and how the EU kind of implement this crisis response. And it's very much they learn from different operations, but they do not draw on the competence of the specific countries. So they have some kind of model that they use in all countries, and they lack the in-depth knowledge about, for instance, the situation in Lebanon. And I think that is the main problem. So they have good intention, but sometimes not the right measures in the specific country. And I'm not an expert on Lebanon and what the EU is doing in Lebanon, but I would expect from our results in this research that some of the same might be true for Lebanon.
Maya, you want to follow up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's interesting because the year 2015 appears to be so decisive both for European asylum and migration policies, but also for the Lebanese policy towards Syrian refugees. Until between 2011 and 2015, it's known Lebanon implemented what is known as a policy of no policy, but in fact it was a policy of the government taking a step back and giving the responsibilities on the one hand to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which decoupled its budget in Lebanon, so tenfold between 2012 and 2015. And then on the other hand, it gave municipalities, Lebanon's more than 1,000 municipalities, a great role when it comes to responding and making local level policies as for refugees. So it's interesting that and then in 2015, there was a drastic policy changed where UNHCR was requested to deregister refugees and to stop their registration of new refugees, in a sense to decrease the number of refugees. And this was an official goal with the new policy that came in 2015, or the first policy that was actually developed, to decrease the number of Syrians in the country by restricting access to territory and encouraging return, and thus also decreasing numbers. And that's also when we start to see a really strong interaction with also the international community and the EU as well, I would say, where Lebanon realized that they can actually also capitalize on Europe's fear of getting refugees, and suddenly everybody had an invested interest in stabilizing Lebanon as well. But this is your expertise, I would say, more than mine. But 2015 is clearly an important year, both for the European context and the Lebanese one.
Thank you.
Tanya, if you can comment on this, and then we'll move on to...
Just a short reaction on the... Well, what is interesting there is a very specific population of refugees also in Lebanon, is the Palestinian refugees from Syria, who arrived, more than 55,000 Palestinian refugees from Syria arrived and settled in Lebanon. And the last month, I think 2 or 3 months ago, I don't remember exactly when, maybe in September, there had been a strike of these Palestinian refugees from Syria, asking to be integrated in the 1951 convention and to be taken by the UNHCR, because they say that, well, it means that the model of being, for them, the possibility of being taken by the UNHCR, that is not the case because they have UNRWA, is to be able to be settled in the third countries and to acquire some rights from their perspective. So this was quite interesting because you have a group of people that were just asking to be integrated in this very model of refugee management and not to be considered as Palestinian refugees with the specific UNRWA. And this is quite new for the Palestinian refugees, that normally they really engage in being only considered by the UNRWA. Well, and I would just make just nuancing probably what I said before. Some of the countries like France, for example, in Lebanon has a lot of interest. So for example, France is now has doubled its participation to UNRWA in order to try to stabilize that situation on the long term. So it's not like as black and white. So of course you have some interest, but I think that the overall discussion on
the relation between emergency action and development issues is not enough worked, and it takes like years and years before people begin to think about, as it could have been thought at the very beginning of the crisis that it would probably last, and probably not go put everything under emergency challenge, but much more on development issues. And it would have been probably better the relation between poor Lebanese and poor Syrians to bring more action that would integrate both populations. That probably could be another way of thinking.
I see we should have had the whole day for just Lebanon right now, but the time is moving on, so I think I'll leave the floor to you, Natasha. And you have a course on the external dimension of European migration policies too, so kind of looking forward to hear your reflections on what are the problems on European migration policies.
Okay, so good. Okay. Good. How does that work? Thank you. Let's roll the PowerPoint. Okay. Good. Yeah. So my presentation is now focusing on the European dimension and EU asylum policy, so the internal dimension of that, pre and post asylum crisis. And I say asylum crisis for a reason, because we've seen a lot of refugees are actually in neighboring countries of Syria, for example, in Lebanon. There are not so many in comparison in Europe. Europe has a population of 510 million inhabitants and received in 2015 around 1 million refugees. So you could say that's not much. But what really led to a crisis was, you could say, the response of European states. There was a huge crisis of trust between states. Some closed their borders, suspended the Schengen Agreement, and that had a lot to do with the fact that they couldn't really agree on a distribution mechanism, relocation of asylum seekers from countries in Europe that received most of the asylum seekers at the time, especially border countries such as Italy and Greece, but also some other countries that are kind of traditional asylum seeker destinations, such as Sweden or Germany. So yeah, that was essentially the crisis. And what I would like to look into now is really policy making that the EU has been doing before and especially since, and to see how if this is potentially addressing some of the shortcomings of the crisis. Briefly, some background and the research questions. So the EU has been actually dealing with migration and asylum policies since the early 2000s actually, and it does have a lot of legislation in this area. Also, you might know the Dublin regulation, which is essentially assigning the responsibility of which member states are supposed to process asylum applications. Usually that's border countries, so countries with the first countries of entry for asylum seekers, but sometimes also countries where, for example, asylum seekers have close family. And usually these negotiations in the early 2000s, for example, they were generally not really contested. And you could see that Northern European member states, Western European member states were quite dominant. The border countries were actually not really involved. Also, the Central and Eastern European countries, when they joined the EU in 2004, they were not really involved. And it's quite interesting that this also was the case after the Arab Spring in 2011, when Italy was, for example, experiencing higher inflows of asylum seekers than previously. They were, of course, at the time quite keen on some kind of solidarity instrument, but they didn't really follow it through. So, at the time, really, negotiations were not contested that much, or perhaps even at all. After 2015, since 2016, the EU has also been reforming its asylum policies and also the Dublin regulation. And it's quite interesting that now this is very much, this is deadlocked. So the negotiations are not going any further. And it actually has a lot to do with deadlock on the Dublin IV regulation, which tries to introduce some solidarity instrument in the sense that border countries or countries that receive a very high number of asylum seekers should be able to relocate asylum seekers to other European countries. So that's really kind of the contested issue. And the question is perhaps why these dynamics and why is there deadlock? just some background on the evolution of the negotiations on the Dublin regulation. So the European Commission proposed a new Dublin regulation in 2016. And there the idea was that whenever a member state had received 150% of its share under a reference key, asylum seekers would be relocated. What is the reference key? It's essentially the idea that asylum seekers should be redistributed in line with GDP and population size, and then kind of depending on the amount of refugees coming into Europe, that they would be redistributed. The initial proposal also suggested that whenever a country wasn't ready to relocate an asylum seeker, but was perhaps responsible for it under the reference key, it would have to pay a fine of 250,000 euros. And especially the Visegrad countries at the time were very much opposed to this because they didn't want to relocate, and they said this is not reasonable, this is just to punish us, we don't want this. And you have to bear in mind that it was also especially the Visegrad countries, so Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, that were very much opposed to a crisis relocation in 2015 and temporary relocation from Italy and Greece. So they didn't want that. So this led to a lot of controversy, but the European Parliament, in a way, went even a little bit further. And here it's quite important to look at the proposal from the rapporteur in the European Parliament, Cecilia Wikström from Sweden, from the Liberals. And she even suggested to completely do away with this first country of entry principle, so to stop border countries being really kind of mainly responsible for this. But at the same time, when there were negotiations in the European Parliament, and this proposal was adopted in the European Parliament, there were also negotiations in the Council of the European Union, so between the member states of the EU. And they were actually really going differently, because, especially because of the role, again, of the Visegrad countries, but interestingly also Italy, and I will show that in a second. The Bulgarian Council presidency was at some point working on a compromise, watering down a little bit the standards from the Commission proposal because it was so contested. And it kind of proposed a three-step approach. So whenever a country would receive 120% of its share, it should receive support from the EU budget and voluntary relocation, but only voluntary, so there was no kind of obligation to do that. Then when a member state had 140% of its share, the other member states should at least try to fill up 50% of their share and relocate. And if they didn't do this, so they should take alternative measures, again, kind of giving money or something like that. And that was obviously to appease the Visegrad countries. And when a country then had 160% of its share, other countries really had to get active, fill up 50% of their share, but they could get a buyout for 25% of their shares if they paid 25,000 euros for every person not relocated. But then there would also be a fine if they didn't relocate more than 25%. Okay. But this, interestingly, was not adopted in the Council, and it had a lot to do with the Visegrad countries, but interestingly also Italy. And you would think Italy is a country that very much actually benefits from solidarity. And also another interesting point is that the European Council, so that's really the heads of state and government, not so much kind of the ministers of the European Union, they at some point decided that decisions should be taken under consensus, and normally decisions on migration in the EU are taken by qualified majority, so you could potentially outvote the Visegrad countries. Not so much Italy, but the Visegrad countries, they don't have enough population to be outvoted. And they essentially said, so the Council said, these decisions have to be taken under unanimity, and that was quite something. So that's also a big part of the deadlock. Now, this is a bit kind of, now I'd like to look at explaining why we don't have a decision on this. This is obviously game theory and a bit hard to digest for a seminar, a breakfast seminar, but it's actually really easy. So the idea of this is that countries that receive asylum seekers, let's say Greece, right? Greece has two options. It can give these people asylum, or it can decide not to give them asylum. But obviously Greece has ratified the Refugee Convention, so not giving these people asylum is actually not an option. I mean, maybe they're trying to use some loopholes, but usually they have to give asylum. But for other countries, let's say for Poland or Germany, to give solidarity to Greece, that's more optional actually. Nobody can force any of these countries to take asylum seekers from border countries. And that's why usually you would end up in a situation where perhaps Greece gives asylum, but Poland doesn't give solidarity because it's purely discretionary. You can't expect it from them. And so this also looks a bit difficult, but it's actually quite easy. So this is essentially looking at the provision differences, how countries would be doing in relation to the reference key. And everything that's below 0, so in the case of Austria, below this, that would mean that a country is actually doing more than they should under the reference key, and everything above 0 means that they're doing too little. And you can see that most countries actually are quite in line with the reference key, right? So there is Germany, they are actually below the reference key, so they are doing more. Greece a little bit, but otherwise none of the countries. And here you can also see Italy. Where is Italy? It should be. Yes, exactly. It's also doing doing more than it would have to under the reference keys. Other countries again not so much. So you would think, okay, only 3 countries essentially benefit at the moment from this reference key. But there are ways to still convince the others to participate. And that is if countries like host countries, let's say Greece or Italy or Germany, either make a threat or promise and link the issue to something else. At some point, for example, some countries were saying, okay, maybe countries that don't engage in this don't get any structural funds anymore. So kind of development support from the EU. And for countries like Poland, that's a big issue actually. Another way would kind of be to give positive incentives or just water down the standards and makes it a bit less of a commitment actually. And that's something that you could actually see quite a lot. There was a lot of watering down. I mean, we've seen the Bulgarian proposal as compared to the Commission proposal. There were these different steps, right? Also, there were package deals saying, okay, border countries get more responsibility, but in response they also have to perhaps make sure that asylum seekers don't, if they arrive in the border countries, they don't have to move on or they don't move to other countries. So there were these kind of package deals and watering down. But what is quite interesting, I mean, the only countries that did not agree to this were actually those with populist governments. Most of the Visegrad countries have populist governments and very kind of strong populist parties, and Italy does as well. And there you could see that actually the populist governments, they don't benefit from a Dublin IV regulation or any solution of the issue. And in the Visegrad countries, that has a lot to do with the fact that the governments present themselves really as the defenders of sovereignty against EU intrusion. The EU wants to impose these quotas. We don't want quotas. And also, there's this perception that there is this kind of massive inflow of non-Christian people, and that they have to do something against it. And again, that's what they get voted for. So if they actually agree to a policy that would lead to relocation, it's not beneficial for these governments. The Italian case is also really interesting because Italy, again, as I said, they opposed this regulation. And it's interesting because in the European Parliament, so the argument that the Italian government gave is, we want the Wikström proposal, we want an end of first country of entry principles. It shouldn't be only on us anymore. But in the parliament, in the negotiations, it was the Italian government that essentially blocked the Wikström proposal. They were against. And so you can see really this is a two-level game. In the council they're saying this is what we want. In the parliament they're opposing this. And some people, so I did some interviews on this, and a lot of people were arguing that obviously Italian populists, they really thrive on the perception of a refugee crisis. If the refugee crisis is gone, then nobody would vote for them anymore. So, and also it's really beneficial for them, obviously, if the EU is unable to act, because it's also a Eurosceptic party. So to conclude, the current CAS, the Common European Asylum System reform, and Dublin reform are actually much more contested than previous reforms, but that doesn't really have to do with higher salience post-crisis. But it has a lot to do with the populist governments that oppose Dublin 4, and that hasn't so much to do with the content, but with the whole idea of having EU legislation on this issue, because they're Eurosceptic and they shouldn't like European legislation to begin with, but also because they really, especially in the case of Italy, benefit from the perception of a refugee crisis. And a quick outlook into kind of the future and what's going to happen now. I mean, there's now a new European Commission forming with the soon-to-be President von der Leyen, and she suggested at some point to abandon the first country of entry principle, also to respond to the Italian critique, which is interesting. So that would be a strong move, you could say. But at the same time, we also have a new Italian government and a new interior minister in Italy, and she has been actually much more also keen on a European solution. She's been also more, let's say, willing to compromise on questions of disembarkation of refugees in the Mediterranean, landing also on Italian shores. So potentially there is actually a possibility to have a decision on Dublin 4 and then kind of a fairer distribution scheme. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Let's go back to the chairs there. And I think the next question goes to Pernille, but also to you. I think maybe if you all can reflect on this. Because in the program, when we invited in here today, one of the questions I posed was if or when the new wave of refugees are coming to Europe, is anything going to be different? Has Europe learned anything from the challenging that they were facing in 2015? And if so, what is different? Pernille, do you want to raise this question? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that something will be different. I think the EU has, to some extent, learned from the crisis. They are more prepared, but maybe not enough. And I think that the biggest problem for the EU is what Natasha was presenting, is the redistribution, the solidarity. And that is more kind of the internal problem. I think where they agree and where they have moved forward is how to handle a crisis when it comes. If there are huge influx of migrants, how to assist the countries that are affected with the hotspots, with the more Commission funding and these kind of things. Also better border control, better search and rescue, all these things, they are better now than previously. When the crisis arrived in 2015, the EU was not prepared at all. So I think that something has changed. And hopefully also on the solidarity issue, we will see some changes now with the new Commission, but also with the change in the Italian government. I think that's where the key problem lies. And then, of course, there are these difference between what is the most important is the to increase the support of hotspots, centers that can take in and register migrants. Better border controls, search and rescue, cooperation with third countries, and try to limit the number of people that actually take the very dangerous journeys. So there are a lot of discussion on this and a lot of issues, problematic issues, when it comes to some see search and rescue, for instance, as a pull factor, and want to reduce that. Others see that of course you have to do search and rescue, and there is no evidence that there will be more people coming with that. So, and then some countries will not having these search and rescue boats receive them at their ports. So then there are some changes in the Italian government now, but it's the solidarity kind of issue that is the most pressing, I think, where they haven't really found a solution yet.
Do you want to comment on that? Do you agree, Natasha?
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's. I mean, in the internal dimension, I would say not much has changed yet. I mean, they've been negotiating for 3 years, but a lot of people that I interviewed actually said if there were a new crisis and more. Or again, kind of lots of people coming in, we wouldn't be prepared because we don't have, like, Dublin isn't reformed. There's no. The issue of solidarity is not addressed. Also, border countries don't implement asylum policies. They don't process asylum applications very well. So there's also this idea to have an agency, an EU agency that should help border countries, but it's also blocked because of Dublin, because there's no consensus on Dublin. And the border countries that want Dublin say, we only accept the agency if you give us Dublin and solidarity. So that's why essentially everything is now blocked. And maybe the new commission can do something, and also with the Italian government, because there would be only the Visegrad countries blocking, and that's a minority. But then there's also the question if, again, these decisions have to be taken under anonymity, so every member state has to agree. That would make it more difficult. And that's quite exceptional. It's actually against EU law, but the European Council has said this, obviously on behalf of the Visegrad countries that wanted this.
So this is particularly only for migration policies?
Yes. Yes, and it's because between the member states in the European Council, so heads of state and government, decisions are taken under anonymity, and they impose this requirement, which is against EU law, because decisions shouldn't be taken under anonymity but qualified majority.
Yes, well, I have a question for you. Very interesting presentation. It's something that I noticed when I was in Syria working on the Iraqi crisis with Swedish people from the Ministry of Interior. And the question was, every time all this, what you describe, is a response to a crisis. Mm-hmm. But is there any reflection in the European Union to try to avoid the crisis and, for example, to make a larger collaboration with UNHCR on resettlement schemes in order to prevent to have to respond to a crisis when you notice that the number of refugees is extremely high in neighboring countries? Is there any kind of perspective of building a long-term policy of resettlement instead of just waiting until the people leave, die in the sea, or come en masse in Europe and having no response? So is there any kind of reflection on this kind of...
The EU is also now working on a resettlement regulation, but which is completely voluntary, so then individual states can say we're happy to resettle or not. But this is also really done strategically with the idea that, okay, this disincentivizes people from coming independently and kind of spontaneously, and they hope to get less refugees this way, kind of in the long run. But my impression also more generally is, I don't know where this is leading, and if there is no crisis, if they're actually using this instrument, because my impression is that policy making in this area is really short-termist, in the sense that when there's a crisis, there's a response, but there is no long-term planning, because it's politically also delicate, and there's populism growing in Europe, and there's no really kind of long-term perspective on kind of addressing these instruments or creating new instruments if there's not a problem in Europe. Because even in 2012, a lot of people in ministries were saying people are soon coming to Europe, and nobody wanted to hear it because it wasn't there yet. They address it when the problem is there.
We'll go 5 minutes over the proposed time. If anybody has to leave, it's okay to leave even now. And I will let Pernille comment, and then we'll accept 2 questions from the audience, as I promised you to. I have a couple of questions from the audience afterwards, if you are burning.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think actually the EU, as I said previously, that the EU actually has some kind of long-term perspective when it comes to because it's easy to agree on try to find or to implement instruments that have kind of tackling the root causes. But then again, it's a challenge on are they doing the right thing? But I think actually that is something that they are better at than maybe handling the crisis when it comes. But the problem is that this is not an easy thing, because when the crisis happened in 2015 and also later, it is also due to some policy of third countries. You know, that the Turkey actually used this as a negotiation card in some sense. Opened their border, they Coast Guard let the boats just pass, and suddenly you had the crisis. So this is a very delicate issue. So the EU-Turkey agreement is a very important one, but it also has some negative sides. That how much can the EU accept? I mean, should they really? I mean, is this? So there are some normatively difficulties with some of these agreements, but I think that I would argue that the EU actually has a long-term perspective, but it's very difficult to find the measures that really helps.
Anybody have any questions from the audience to anybody in the panel? If there's nobody burning on any questions, I have a... No, you're all good. Then I will, because
Or could I answer the question,
yes,
or answer the question that you asked?
Yes,
I can chip in.
But also, I wanted you to reflect on one of the things that you said that I've been thinking about. There is this impression, at least that I have, that the Refugee Convention is continuously being kind of watered out, and interpretations, at least in the European setting, that the way we interpreted the Refugee Convention 10 years ago is not the same as we interpret it today, and that you have this tendency of using it only when it's convenient, and then we look the other way when it's not. Would you agree to that kind of understanding? And in that light, what is the future of the convention also in the European setting? I'm thinking, is it possible, is it true that the states are kind of just, when the pressures are too strong on the states, they just put it aside and then they do whatever they want anyway?
It's a really interesting question, and I will answer it also by answering the previous question that you had, because I see that they are interlinked very strongly. In 2015, I wasn't in Europe, so I couldn't follow developments here, but I was in Lebanon, so I could see how Lebanon, in a sense, was following developments in Europe very, very closely. So there were daily news reports exactly about what was going on following the asylum seeker migrant trail throughout Europe in most of the big Lebanese newspapers. When I was interviewing government officials for my research on Lebanon's relationship to the 1951 Refugee Convention, this was also presented as one of the main reasons why should we ratify now? Look at all of the countries in Europe. All of them are states parties to the Refugee Convention, and look how refugees are being treated in many of the countries in Europe who supposedly are to uphold refugee protection principles. So this was presented as a reason, as a justification even, to why they haven't ratified the convention. I think the million-dollar question, we have 55 countries in the world that haven't ratified the convention. Many of these host large refugee populations. So we have 4 countries in the world that are on the top 7 refugee hosting countries that haven't ratified the convention, and together host 1/3 of all of the world's refugees, just these 4 top countries. The million-dollar question is, do refugees in states that have ratified the convention, do they receive better protection than in states that haven't? And it's a super difficult question. And what if the answer is in the negative? What if we look into this and we realize that they don't? This is one of the things that I will be looking into with my new project team starting in June 2020 for 5 years. So I'm hoping that maybe we can have another talk about this issue in a couple of years' time, and we can see the development here, because it's a really, and it goes to the very heart of, do international conventions matter at all?
Yeah, and I think it sums up very nicely all of the issues that we have been discussing today. Kind of how can we, because I think migration policy demands long-term cooperation and commitment between states. It's not something that the states can solve alone. And then we need kind of the tools to actually regulate this. So understanding better how the current tools work or don't work and how they can be improved, I think. I hope to invite you back, all of you, when we have continued the research. Thank you to the audience for coming. I have a small present for you, our international friends coming to the panel. This is what we use in Norway when you go cross-country skiing in the winter. So you can sit down and you can have hot cocoa, chocolate.
Thank you.
Freezing.
That's very generous.
You guys are. You want the red ones?
More red. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Oh, so much more to discuss.